Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we are on lesson 27, chapter 27, which is all about working with web-based forms. What we're going to learn in this lesson is how HTML forms work. We're going to learn how to create the front end of an HTML form. We're going to learn how to name pieces of form data, how to include hidden data types, how to include hidden data in forms. We're going to learn how to choose the correct form input controls for different situations. We're going to learn how to validate form data, how to submit form data, and how to use the form object with JavaScript. So most of our lessons so far is focused on getting information out to others. But you can also view your webpage as a place to gather information from the people who read or interact with your website. Web forms let you receive feedback, orders, and other information from users who visit your web pages. Google is a single entry form. You insert a field and you can search all with a single button. When you click that button, it gives you all the information you're looking for and then some. If you ever ordered anything from Amazon, you have used forms before. We're only going to learn how to create the front end of those forms. Working with the server-side handling of forms requires knowledge of programming languages, and it's beyond the scope of this lesson. So we're going to learn how to make a form and grab user information and data. What would happen next to save it to a database is all server-side stuff. So we're not going to talk about any of the server-side stuff, just the client side. This chapter goes on with how HTML forms work. An HTML form is part of a web page that includes areas where users can enter information to be sent back to you, to another email address that you specify, or to a database that you manage, or another system altogether. Before we learn the HTML elements to make our forms, we need to at least conceptually understand how the information from those forms makes its way back to you. So we're learning the client side of a form. If you want to add your information that a user types on your website to a database, you should work with someone that has knowledge or learn the basics on your own, such as how to use PHP, which is a popular server-side programming language. So simple form processing is not that difficult. Your web hosting provider, if you use, will likely have several back-end scripts that you can use with minimal customization. But this is we're going to talk about the front end and how to gather that information. So a form includes a button for the user to submit the form. That button can be an image that you create, or it can be a standard HTML form button that's created when a form input element is given and a type value of submit. When someone clicks submit, all the information typed in the form is sent to a URL specified in the action attribute of the form element. The URL should point to a specific script that will process your form, sending the form contents via email, or performing another step such as requesting results from a search engine or placing the items in the online shopping cart, etc. So when you start thinking about doing more with form content than simply emailing the results to yourself, you need additional technical knowledge. For example, if you wanted to create an online store, you need to accept credit cards and process transactions. But first, we'll start simple and then work our way to more challenging stuff. So creating a form. Every form must begin with a form tag. It can be located anywhere in the body of the HTML document. The form tag has three attributes: name, method, and action. If you look in your book, it has an example of the form tag with the attributes. The most common method is post, which sends the form entry results as a document. In some situations, you need to use method get, which submits the results as part of the URL query string instead. For example, get is sometimes used when queries are submitted to search engines from a web form. Because we're not an expert on forms yet, we're just going to use post unless our web hosting provider documentation tells us otherwise. The action attribute specifies the address for sending the form data. You have two options. You can type the location of a form processing program or script on a web server, and the form data will be sent to that program. Or you can type mail to, followed by your email address, and the form data will be sent directly to wherever someone fills out the form. For example, you can look in your book and it shows you form, method post, action, mail to, and then send to the email address. This approach is completely dependent on the user's computer being properly configured with an email client. So people accessing your site from a public computer without an email client won't be able to do this. If you look in chapter 27, it gives you an example of a form with various user input components. Notice how they're done with the input tag and the label tag. This form has a lot of inputs such as name, email address. It has some questions with checkboxes. It has a drop-down, so it contains quite a few input tags. Each input tag corresponds to a specific user input component, such as a checkbox or radio button. The input, select, text area, and button elements contain borders in the style sheet, so it's easy to see the outline of each element on the form, and that keeps it all separated. When we accept text from the input tag, the tag does not explicitly need to appear between the form tags. Putting there is good practice, but you can place input elements anywhere on the page alongside text, images, and other HTML tags. The type indicates what type of form to display, in this case a simple one-line text entry box. In this example, note the use of placeholder, required, and autofocus attributes. This placeholder attribute lets you define some text that appears in the text box but disappears when the user begins to type. Using this attribute can give the user a bit more guidance for completing your form. If you ever noticed some forms where it asks you to enter your phone number, then it gives you a format of how you want the phone number to look, and then once you start typing it disappears, that is a placeholder. There's also a max length attribute, which defines the number of characters the user is allowed to type into that text box. Then you want to name each piece of form data. No matter what type an input element is, you must give a name to the data it gathers. You can use any name you like for each input item, as long as each one in the form is different. So if a user enters their name in the text box, a variable is sent to the form processing script. The variable is username, and the value of the variable is the person's name that they typed in. Then you notice another tag, a label tag. Labeling your data is not the same as a name or ID attribute to identify. Instead, the label tag pair surrounds text that acts as sort of a caption for a form element. A form element label is additional context for the element, which is especially important for screen reader software. You can see the examples in your book. The label surrounding the first question the user is asked, what is your name? The use of the for attribute ties this label to the input element with the same ID. It's used also for more than just screen readers. It makes forms more usable because when the user clicks the label, the focus is moved to that field. Grouping form elements is another thing we need to consider. You can see that the use of field set and legend elements 3 different times in this example to create 3 different groups of form fields. The field set element surrounds groups of form elements to provide additional context for the user. The field set element just defines the grouping. The legend element contains the text that will display or be read aloud to describing the grouping. You can also include hidden data in forms. You want to send certain data items to the server script that processes a form, but don't want the user to see those items. Use an input tag with type hidden. This attribute has no effect on the display and just adds any name and value you specify to the form results when they're submitted. It also talks about exploring the form input controls. Various input controls are available for retrieving information from the user. Checkboxes is one of them. It's one of the simplest input types, and it appears as a small square. The user can then check the box or deselect one or more of these in the group, and it shows you in this example how to use checkboxes. Radio buttons, for which only one choice can be selected at a time, are almost just as simple to implement as checkboxes, and your book gives you an example of how to implement both of these. The value attribute can be any name or code you can choose, and if you include the checked attribute, the button is selected by default. No more than one radio button with the same name can be checked. When designing your form, choose between checkboxes and radio buttons. Determine whether the question being asked or implied could be answered in only one way. If so, use a radio button. And then you can create both scrolling list and pull down pick list with the select tag. You can use this tag together with the option tag, as shown in the example in your book. Then when it talks about text fields, text areas, and other input types, so we know the input of type text attribute mentioned earlier in this lesson allows the user to enter only a single line of text. When you want to allow multiple lines of text in a single input element, use the text area tags to create text area instead of just the text field. Any text you include between these 2 tags is displayed as the default entry in that box. You can also use event handlers to detect when the value of a text changes. The text and text area objects support the following event handlers: on focus, on blur, on change, and on select. If these event handlers are used, they should be included in the input tag declaration, and then it goes over and talks about some more basic input elements. HTML5 provides many more type options for input than simply text, such as built-in date pickers, and here are a few different input types. We can see that some are new and some are old, but they're all fully supported. Here are a few different input types. You can have a type email, type file, type number, type range, type search, type URL. And then you can add data to text fields. So once you have a text field, you can add data to the field to provide customers with a list of suggested values. They can fill in the field with their own value instead, but either way, it gives them options. To add data, you need to add a data list to the page and then link to that list with the list attribute in the field where you want the data to appear. Gives you an example of this in the book, such as a list of choices or like a drop-down list that you've seen on forms. You can also use HTML5 for form validation. Many features have made web developers really happy for creating forms that are available in HTML5. Before HTML5, you had to create JavaScript to do form validation, which was really annoying, but HTML5 has form validation by default. It lets you use the noValidate attribute in the form element. Of course, if you do not use the required attribute in the form fields themselves, or if you don't use specific input options like email or URL, there's nothing to validate. So as you learned in previous lessons, not only are fields validated for content, any content at all, they're also validated according to the type they are. For example, you can use a text input for everything. Someone wants to use an email, you should use email. Someone wants to use phone number, you should use number. So to validate an email address, it's simply as like just checking to see if it looks like an email address with the @ symbol and then something.com. You can also use pattern recognition to make sure the user types in a certain pattern. Then at the end, it talks about submitting form data. It's common for a form to include a button that submits the form data to a script on the server or invokes a JavaScript action. You can use the value attribute to put any label you like on the submit button. You can access all these form elements with JavaScript, and then your book goes through and shows an example of displaying data from a form. So this example is a simple example of interacting with forms purely on the client side. It shows a form with a name, address, and phone number fields, as well as a JavaScript function that displays the data from the form in a pop-up window. So once the form, all the data is inputted, it uses JavaScript to display it back in a pop-up window. Gives you a breakdown of the code of what it's doing. So coming up next, I'm going to share my screen with you, and I'm going to show you some of these examples so you can see what they look like. Next example. This is just a couple entries in a form. This is part of the example in your book. So I'm going to show you that for grabbing some personal information, notice how the personal information is in this area, which is this field set area. We have our label. It says, what is your name? And then our input, type text, ID, the name, placeholder, enter your full name. So this is the placeholder here, enter your full name. Please use a real one. That's the placeholder there. Notice if I click on this, it's a blue highlighted around, and if I click on this, now if I start typing in some stuff here and some stuff here, I can click erase and start over, it erases it. If I click fill in standard values, it will fill in your name, year, at yourdomain.com. And it says, don't forget to give your feedback and submit the form. So I can erase this. And if I go to click submit without typing anything, it says, please fill out this field. So if I fill this out, click here, it says, please fill out this field. Now, if I just type some letters, it gives me an error. Please include an @ in the email address. It's missing the @ symbol. So we need that @ symbol to be a valid email address. This is just some of the styling that's done there. That's in your book. Notice how we have our form, method post. In our field set tags, we have a legend that says personal information, and we have this label and input, our buttons, submit button, reset button, and then another button that says ID standard values. And we're using some JavaScript to fill in the standard values. So we're saying document.getElement by ID standard values. Add event listener, this click function that grabs the name, the email, and it adds this value, your name here and this email here. So that's the JavaScript that fills in these values. And then this document.getElement ID errors.innerHTML adds this text, don't forget to give your feedback and submit the form up here. That's a simple form. Next example is creating a form and displaying the information with JavaScript. So if we look, if I type in my name, S, click display it here. So it's grabbing that information and displaying it. So how is it doing this? Well, it's creating this form and these form tags. This is a method get. We're saying input name, input address, phone, input type button, value display, ID display. So we're saying this function display, opening a new window, and we're adding this message. We're creating an unordered list with a list item name, and we're doing document.form1.name.value, which is this, name.value. Address, this is this, and the value of it, and the value of the phone number, and then we're saying display window.document.write message. Document.get element by ID, display. Add event listener, click display. And that's how we're getting it to do that. I hope those examples helped. Coming up next, we have our Lesson 27 PowerPoint presentation, so stay tuned.